Is everything okay? Hello, everyone. Is everyone on the call? Great. So, hello and welcome to our Racism in Football, How Can We End It event for the Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism. Today, we will aim to cover an overview of racism in football over the last few years and what the solutions may be to kicking racism out of football. We are joined by Tony Burnett, who is the current CEO of Kick It Out. Kick It Out is an independent campaign which works with various institutions involved in football, from governments to fan groups, to eradicate all forms of discrimination from the game. Tony was previously an assistant director for diversity and inclusion with the West Midlands Police, and he has also held senior diversity and inclusion roles at Lloyds Banking Group and Ford. Thank you so much for coming on, Tony.
Thanks for asking, Lucie.
The discussion will be broken down into three main parts. First, we will talk about instances of racism within football stadium and whether governing bodies have appropriately policed and punished the abusers. Secondly, we will discuss online abuse and how social media companies can be properly regulated, particularly in the wake of the Euros final last year, where Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho, and Bukayo Saka suffered from vile abuse. And finally, we will discuss the successes and failures of messaging, education, and other initiatives aimed at putting a stop to racism. We'll be in discussion for around 40 minutes, leaving about 20 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. In this final segment, I will be able to unmute you, and you can ask your question directly to Tony by pressing the raise hand feature. To begin with, Tony, could you tell us a little bit more about what Kick It Out does, as well as what impact it has had on football?
Yeah, so we were formed 28 years ago, initially as Let's Keep Racism Out of Football. It was the charity's name, and I guess the name reflected the mission at the time. It was all about racism. Since then, we've evolved, and we now tackle all forms of discrimination, because we essentially recognise that quite often people who are racists are often discriminatory on lots of other grounds, and we don't think you can tackle one form of racism without having a similarly robust stance on lots of others, and that's not even to mention kind of intersectionality. So our mission is around helping football to be a place where everyone belongs. To try and do that, our role is to bring the footballing governing bodies together, which is easier said than done. The FA, the Premier League, the EFL, and the PFA, to name the main ones. And we work around three kind of core agendas. The first one is voice. We try and give a voice to our beneficiaries from different backgrounds and underrepresented groups. So we had a big part to play, for example, in the Tracy Crouch review last year, trying to represent the voices of fans from different backgrounds. We do a huge amount of work around skills development. So we do a lot of the training for example, the academy players in all the 92 football clubs. Any young player up to age 23, they usually do their ED&I training with Kick It Out, and have done for a number of years. And we provide lots of other skills training opportunities. And the third bit we work on is talent. So we've got a big program we're about to relaunch very soon, which is around trying to get people from underrepresented groups and give them access to careers within football, whether that's in the coaching area, whether it's performance, whether it's accounting or marketing and media. But those are our kind of three core areas, and we work across different sectors. So most people will see us in the professional men's game, but we're active as well in the women's game. We're active at grassroots, and we're also increasingly active in the non-league area as well.
Great. And you've formed partnerships with England and Wales cricket boards very recently, and with Sky Sports in a £2 million deal. So what are the effects of sort of Kick It Out's recent expansions, even to outside football now?
Well, part of our strategy, I mean, we did a lot of research on our brand over the last 18 months, and we recognised that although our brand was invented as a tool for football, so Kick It Out obviously was a term that was used to represent football, a lot of our stakeholders don't know that, essentially. So they just see us as an anti-racism charity or anti-discrimination charity, which is brilliant. And so we looked at what we do. We looked at some of the other sports, and the cricket scenarios kind of come about quicker than we thought it would. But our plan for some time now has been to expand into other sports, because a lot of the issues that we tackle around discrimination are present in other sports. So cricket we see just as a natural extension. I think cricket's going to be a different challenge, because some of the barriers for people progressing and accessing cricket are completely different to what we see in football. So for example, one of the big barriers in cricket is that I want to quote, I won't bore you with stats, I'll just quote a few just to make a point, if I may. So you're 13 times more likely to make it to be a professional cricketer if you went to private school than if you go to state school. That's irrespective of your race. You know, white boys compared to white boys, you're 13 times more likely to be a professional cricketer if you go to a private school. That, and from an intersectionality perspective, that's huge, because what that means is there's obviously a social class divide. We know for a fact that a higher proportion of kids from Black and Asian backgrounds are in the state school system. So de facto, that means clearly there's going to be an issue when it comes to getting talent from state schools into the game of cricket. So there are some structural challenges we've got to face into if we're going to be in cricket, but it's the start of a journey, and we're looking forward to tackling some of those issues, not least the issues that Azim Rafiq's raised around kind of racism in the dressing room as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to hear a lot more about cricket, but going back to football now for the rest of the discussion. In the last decade, there have been obviously numerous reports of racism on the football pitch between football players. It includes John Terry with Anton Ferdinand, Luis Suarez with Patrice Evra, Andres Cordella with Glenn Kamara a little bit more recently, and Kilo Casilla with Jonathan Neko of West Brom, who also criticised Kick It Out and the Players Football Association for not receiving enough support. Players who racially abused their opponents received match bans ranging between sort of 4 and 12 matches and receiving thousands of pounds worth of fines. But have governing bodies appropriately reprimanded footballers for such incidents of racism?
I think historically, no. I don't think that's the case, and I think we saw a lot of that with the John Terry and Anton Ferdinand incident, and a lot of the governing bodies, I think, took on board what was wrong. I certainly believe now that in this era, with the strength of the players, so just for example, we've got our own players board made up of Black and Asian players and female players from across the piece. If an incident like that happened now, our players board would have a clear view of what we should be doing about it, and would be telling us and pushing us to do exactly what they think would be the right thing. Similarly, the Premier League have got a Black players group, so there are voices now and players representative boards that just wouldn't let situations like that occur. I think that's one of the positives. I'm not saying it's perfect, because it's not. But the other thing is, I think we've got to be sensible as well when it comes to education of players, particularly at the elite level, because the more and more players now that are coming from different countries, and those countries that often that people come from have got different cultural norms. And so we've got to take a responsibility, and I know the PFA are aware of this, around educating people when they come to this country, that what the norms are and what the expectations are around not just race discourse, but we bring people to this country, for example, where it's from countries where it's illegal to be gay. It's really important that we educate people actually what's acceptable and what's appropriate practice when it comes to the UK. And that's not abdicating responsibility for British-born players as well, because British-born players absolutely have a responsibility to behave appropriately.
Yeah, you're talking a little bit there about players coming from maybe abroad and having to get educated. I'd like to quickly talk about the incidents involving Edison Cavani and Bernardo Silva.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, Cavani used the word in Spanish on social media, which was deemed to be offensive language, and he was subsequently banned for 3 matches and had to pay a £100,000 fine, whereas Bernardo Silva was banned for 1 match and had to pay a fine of £50,000 after he likened his black teammate to a cartoon figure on the front of the Spanish chocolate packet. Both Edison and Cavani and Bernardo Silva did not feel that the discipline was fair at all. Likes of Ander Herrera, who now plays for Paris Saint-Germain, and a Uruguayan academic institution defended Cavani's use of the words online. And in the case of Bernardo Silva, Raheem Sterling came out and also publicly defended Bernardo Silva, as well as Pep Guardiola. So with those sort of instances, how should football governing bodies deal with them, and when they're in their opinion, the language used by Bernardo Silva or Edison Cavani or other related issues, they believe that these were instances where misunderstood in translation.
This is a great example of what I kind of saw. I worked quite a bit in South Africa, for example, over 20 years, extensively. And they use the term, those of you who've been or worked in or from South Africa, their racial definitions include the term coloured. And the so-called coloured community in South Africa define themselves by that term. Completely unacceptable here. If a player came from South Africa and saw somebody like me, for example, who they would probably refer to as being coloured, that'd be completely unacceptable. And that's what I mean about the education. So the first bit is about making sure that we get the education right so that players understand the cultural norms that are acceptable here, particularly around language and use of language. And I think those two examples are great examples of that. I think you then get onto a different discussion when you get outside of that, which is impact versus intent. I think the reason those two players were defended by their teammates is because their teammates knew, especially their black teammates knew, that they hadn't intended offence. It was just probably a stupid comment through lack of education about our cultural context. Where the intent is different, this is where the Cadella incident involving Glenn Kamara, I think, was completely different. There was no positive intent there at all, actually. There was nothing other than the intent to insult, to be completely derogatory to Glenn Kamara by using a racial slur. And I think that's different. And that's often a difficult judgment to make around impact versus intent. And context is difficult, it's challenging when it comes to racism quite often. But I think that's where we draw the line.
Okay. And we can't also ignore media and how the media represents these issues. It seems that when sort of the news cycle has moved on from punishment, we go back into a normal day-to-day life, and such footballers continue to be glamorized, particularly in the example of, let's say, Luis Suarez. Have the media generally presented these issues with care in the view of Kick It Out?
To be completely honest, I think the media are complicit in this problem. So, and there's a couple of issues here. So, last 12 months since I've been with Kick It Out, obviously we've been through the whole issue of the England team, the whole kind of challenge around taking the knee, and what we went through, obviously, with the England team. And then following that, actually, since the start of this season, we've seen a really positive response from the vast majority of fans across the country. You see it on TV when the live games are happening now. The vast majority of people in the country understand why the players take the knee and applaud it. I still get asked on a regular basis. Millwall played Crystal Palace a few weeks ago. I had journalists calling in the week running up to that game, asking for advanced comments based on the fact that they thought Millwall fans were going to boo taking the knee. In 12 months, and in the 18 months since George Floyd, I've never had a journalist ask me about why a player's taking the knee, what are the issues of structural racism that impact football. The FA Cup third round is a great example. I challenged the journalist back and I said, rather than asking me about booing taking the knee, why don't you ask me how many black or Asian coaches are in the dugout for the third round of the FA Cup, or ask me about how many black, Asian or female referees are going to be in the centre circle for the third round of the FA Cup? Because the answer to those questions would have been zero. That's a robust debate. And so I think our journalists, and I had this conversation on Tuesday, actually, at another podcast event, our journalists have to take responsibility for the line of questioning and the dialogue that they open up in these issues, because I think they go for cheap shots, and I think they miss. And I think for 18 months now, since George Floyd, our press and our journalists have missed a really huge opportunity to open up a dialogue on serious issues by constantly talking about gestures. And I'll just really quickly finish off on that, if you don't mind, Rich, what happened in Bristol is a great example. Statues. No one talked about the bigger conversation, which is slavery, which is historic wealth generation through slavery, which is the fact that slaves were never received reparations, and the amount of wealth that different individuals and different countries generated. I probably saw 2 interesting articles on that. The whole thing focused on whether we should drag statues down or not, which is just a ridiculous conversation without any broader context. So I think journalists have got a huge responsibility. And the last thing I'll say on this in journalists is just look at the representation. And this is where I think, again, it's flawed. I went to the Sports Journalists Awards event in London just before Christmas. You look around the room, they're all white men of my age and above. And so it's not surprising, actually, we're not having a really honest, open conversation about not just race, but about what it's like to be LGBTQ plus in football and sport, and what it's like to be a woman in sport, which is massively topical at the minute. So, yeah. I think journalism's got a huge question to answer when it comes to how they represent the issues.
And moving on to fans, of course, this can sometimes be quite hard to police. One instance that comes to my head is when Antonio Rudiger, while playing against Tottenham, heard racist chants, but nothing was found in the end. West Midlands Police, which I'm sure you have a lot more sort of know-how about there, appointed the first dedicated football hate crime officer, PC Stuart Ward. Should this position be rolled out across other regions? And also, what may be the potential problems with a hate crime officer when they're doing their job, or what they might miss out?
There's a few challenges there. So I think the first one is there's far too much reliance on stewards now within grounds, and so steward training is a massive issue. And essentially, again, you saw this at the Euros, but we're asking people who are on minimum wage to confront individuals who are behaving appallingly, and quite often, through drink and other substances, and put themselves at risk to challenge the behaviours. And I think that's a massive ask of people, particularly when it's not a massively well-paid job, and it's not their full-time job quite often. So I think that's a problem to start off with. I think the lack of education for fans has been poor over the years, and so we have a number of chants and a number of behaviours, not just racist behaviour, but this season we've seen a massive increase in people using the rent boy chant. We still see people using anti-Semitic chants, not just Spurs fans, but as weapons against Spurs fans. So I think there's a whole, and then misogyny is rife in whatever ground you go in quite often, particularly if there is a female official as a lines person or in the ground. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on here, I think stewarding needs to be looked at in terms of the training and how we better support stewards and get better and more equipped stewards. The second bit is about fan education, because I think we need to draw some really clear lines for fans around what's appropriate behaviour. Because what I see in football culture, and I've been a fan all my life and played at kind of grassroots and semi-pro level, what I see in football culture is appalling, and it's not fit for the modern era. Certainly in some instances. And then you get onto the police, which I think should be the last bit of this. We should sort this before it gets to the police. But when we do get to policing, I'm not sure that having a Stuart Ward in every region is the answer. I think the answer is, so for example, every club has their own process for collecting data and their own process for dealing with discrimination, which is ridiculous. 92 processes, 92 clubs not sharing information or data. If all the football clubs, and it's one of the things we're working with clubs on, adopted similar processes, we could pool central resources, we could respond to incidents really quickly by having a central resource, and we could really tackle the serious offences that need to be tackled through criminal intervention and police intervention. We could tackle really quickly. But that needs clubs' commitment, all committed to the same things, and a similar process for doing it. And then the last bit is the CPS. So I don't think people understand. So, and the rent boy chant's a great example. That's only just been classified as a crime essentially, and we can use that now to really enforce behavioural standards. But that discussion's been going on for kind of 12 months. So what the CPS classify as hate crime compared to malicious communications, for example, is it's another can of worms. And I don't think fans understand that. And yeah, it's a challenge.
Perhaps more difficult to police would be online abuse.
Yeah, absolutely.
In many respects. But starting, going off from last summer and, alleged meetings between Boris Johnson and social media companies and some government intervention, have there been any improvements since in these last 9 months or so?
I mean, the bills, the online harms bill, online safety bill is going through. I think there's a big question mark over what it covers, but our stance has been really clear throughout. And obviously, it's far broader than just protecting players and protecting the game of football. There's some really serious consequences for the online harms bill. So other organisations who look after vulnerable children, for example, are far better equipped to talk about that than me. But from a football perspective, the 4 areas we've campaigned for consistently, the first one is around social media organisations having more people on the ground and more people to intercept and stop these messages getting through. So, and we had a massive row with the social media organisations on the back of the Euros, because we knew way before the Euros happened. We had conversations with them to say, you need to be ready, because if unfortunately, if any of our black players, make a mistake or miss a penalty in a key game, there's going to be a backlash. It happened in the final. We knew what was coming, and yet the social media organisations didn't have the level of commitment required to stop it. That's nothing other than a lack of will, desire, and putting the resources in place to deal with it. And we see that a lot. A lot of the stuff that doesn't get blocked or doesn't get taken down quick enough, it's not the fault of process. It's the fault of a lack of resource and a lack of desire to do the right thing. And they're not doing the right thing because it costs money. And that's where the online harms bill is absolutely necessary to force the right level of action. The second area we push for is account verification, because it's too easy to be a keyboard warrior and kind of tap stuff in and send it off. And again, social media organizations come up with excuses as to why they don't want to do account verification, but we've seen loads of systems that make it really easy to verify people who want to send messages. Third bit is around sanctions, and thankfully now we've seen actually in the recent weeks a significant decrease in online hate crime when it comes to football, on the back of prosecutions. People are starting to get sent to prison now for this, which is huge. So there's things are happening, but we'll wait to see if the online harms bill, and see whether the fourth bit is the regulator, because they're talking about Ofcom as being the regulator for the online harms, which is absolutely fine, but it's what they're regulating on. So we're all, I'm assuming, sick of listening to Facebook and Twitter trot out the same nonsense every time there's an incident about how seriously they take this stuff. But they report on the information that they decide themselves they want to report on. So we've no idea as a game of football or as a society whether stuff is really improving or not. And so we're reliant on the regulator. We want the regulator to force social media organizations to publish robust stats, the stats that we decide and they decide they should, not what the social media organizations decide they should publish. So we can really clearly see what progress they're making and where they're investing the money and resources in terms of trying to stop this stuff.
You talked there about identification, and maybe there should be processes for IDing people. Joey Durso of the Athletic notes that sort of anonymity online has been useful for people protesting against governments, and that certain governments of other countries who tend to monitor internet usage more often could use sort of identification to their advantage. So, and I think IP addresses are used sometimes as a method now to sort of suspend accounts. But what other than sort of, human monitoring, which you also mentioned, and identification, is there any way we can sort of hold social media platforms to account?
Well, the other issue that comes up over, a good example of this one is kind of anti-Semitic abuse, algorithmic amplification, and the messages that people get. It has to stop. I mean, they use it to sell us products and services, but they also use it to amplify messages that are just abhorrent to vast majority of people. And it's not just, in the policing days, we saw this becoming a problem a number of years ago, particularly when it comes to radicalization of people with extreme or on the verge of radicalization, and they're bombarded with messages through algorithmic amplification that they shouldn't be. And I think it's the same in football, and they've got to take responsibility for that as well. If they can use that to sell us products, they can turn it off when it comes to some of the other challenging issues, but they have to have the will, and they also have to have the impetus to do it, and that's got to come from government. It's got to come from regulation.
So some players have obviously decided to boycott, most notably Thierry Henry, until social media platforms resolve these issues that you're talking about, which are hugely complex. It's not fair to demand that all players follow suit and boycott social media themselves, but is there any other form of protest and messaging that players can, or the general public can take part in to sort of force change through?
If I'm being really honest but cynical, the only thing that major corporations understand is finance, is money, and if they see a perceived risk to revenue, they'll take action really, really quickly. That's why copyright infringement is such a kind of massive issue for social media organizations. So the ban was good in terms of raising awareness, but it wasn't particularly harmful when it comes to revenues of the likes of Facebook or Twitter, and which is why you didn't see a huge amount of action on the back of it. So mass movements would have to have a serious dent in the pockets of the likes of Facebook and Twitter for it to be useful. And we only do that we would only achieve that by mobilizing millions and millions of people over a long period of time, probably billions of people in Facebook's case over a period of time. But the likelihood of that is challenging. There
are obviously also very difficult laws to go around, such as data protection, which is incredibly hard to manage, and use identification and so on. Where does the buck stop with us holding social media platforms to account? Can we fairly and properly prosecute social media platforms for perpetuating racist abuse? Why has that not happened?
Well, I think this is part of the Online Harms Bill as well. This is I think that for the first time, and it's I think the beauty of what's happened over the last kind of 12 months, and this is where football I think does play a positive role in society. The important thing about the online harm stuff is not really. I don't mean that to trivialize it, but it's not really football. It's the knock-on impacts, positive impacts it can have for lots of other areas of society. And football being so high profile, if we can use football as a vehicle to get the changes through that are needed, I see that as being a massive positive. But for we have to have regulation in place. This is for me, this is the biggest single thing that we can do through the Online Harms Bill is force the social media organisations to be responsible, and that's got to be done through a regulatory body like Ofcom. But I also have to say, obviously, we've been through this before with other industries, water, gas, electricity, etc. And the regulators also got to have teeth. And so the numbers that are being talked about, like 10% of global turnover for infringing regulations, have to be enforced. That's the way that the social media organisations will respond. If they feel it in their pocket, they'll put the resources in place to make it a reality.
Brilliant. Thanks for talking about elaborating so much on sort of the online abuse, and we've already talked about taking the knee somewhat. But what is the best thing that the public, footballers, and governing bodies can generally do to eradicate racism and discrimination?
Oh, this is a difficult one, because I think one of the challenges again for us is, and you talked about my background before, and I mentioned to you I worked quite a bit in South Africa, is we obviously football operates within the broader context of society, and I think in the UK certainly we've got a really challenging societal situation at the minute when it comes to the post-Brexit scenario, the George Floyd, etc., etc. And I think people are more polarised than ever when it comes to some of these issues. You're seeing that in the what's happening in the political landscape at the minute, certainly on the last election. And so I think it's a really difficult time for us. But I think football, whilst it hasn't got a responsibility to change society, I think what it can do is it can set an example. Because it's so popular, it can drive discussions, which is why I'm so disappointed really with the level of conversation that journalists kind of propel in this space. Because I don't think it's for footballers to talk about it, but what we should be talking about is where the construct of racism came from. Why we've had this plague for the last 500 years. Why it was constructed to support the notion of slavery and the inferiority of black people, so that you can subjugate black people for slavery. The fact that the reparations were never paid to slaves, the fact that reparations totaling £16 billion were paid to slave owners, and we're only finished, that debt was only finished being paid in 2015. So the descendants of slaves like myself, through our taxes, were paying reparations to slave owners. That creates a context. And I think one of the things that you see in the UK now, particularly around racism, is still the legacy of that construct, which is black people. The notion is black people are inferior to white. That's what racism is, essentially. And until we really tackle that, and our government are in complete denial of structural racism and systemic bias, which is just a ridiculous scenario, but isn't surprising actually, and I'm not just talking about the Conservative Party here. Labour in power for many years did nothing about this. Until we tackle into some of these really deep-seated issues and have the conversations, we're never going to change. We're never going to change the things that need to be changed. And I think football can start driving some of those discussions. That's what we'd be keen to do, is really start having those honest conversations about where racism, for example, comes from, and what we need to do about it.
And beyond domestic governments, international governments obviously have to work together to drive forward the same message. How effective have sort of UEFA's campaigns been on respect, or FIFA, even so, who in last few days you criticised Gianni Infantino for making remarks about migrant Africans and the biennial World Cup. How do we fix the sort of international cooperation on driving forward these same messages?
I think we're a million miles away, but again, I think FIFA and UEFA represent probably some of the global construct and where the power base lies. So Infantino's comments for me were incredibly patronising towards Africa and Black people, essentially. But that demonstrates a Western mindset of where the power is, doesn't it? Ultimately, that's all he was demonstrating, and that's played out in lots of scenarios in the way FIFA treat different countries and different organisations across the world. I think FIFA have got some major problems. You know, any organisation that can award a World Cup to Qatar has got to answer some serious questions, and I think so that for me speaks volumes. And I still believe that having a World Cup in Qatar from an LGBTQ plus perspective is just like there is no difference to having a World Cup in apartheid South Africa. And I just don't understand how a decision like that could have been made. UEFA, we see time and again the decisions they make around clubs' infringement of racism in particular. We saw at the Euros their attitude to Hungary, for example, when it came to LGBTQ plus issues, and it was just appalling. And what that kind of led to was the bizarre spectacle of our players having to play in front of Hungarian fans and being subject to various forms of abuse, stewards being set upon, and except because the governing bodies are not prepared to take their responsibility seriously enough to do the things that need to be done. So I don't think FIFA and UEFA are anywhere on this topic, actually, on any of these issues, anywhere near where they should be. So that's we don't count on FIFA or UEFA to drive the changes that are needed at all.
There's a possibility that if Tracy Crouch's review into football governance is accepted by the government and falls through, there would be an independent regulator. Do you think the independent regulator should, aside from working with football finance, should work with discrimination in football?
Yeah, completely. We did 2 papers for that review, and one of them specifically talked about what an independent regulator needed to do, because, again, I think it's one of the challenges we've got with football. So let me just give you, again, I'll just quote a couple of stats. Everyone knows management, and everyone kind of recognises that other than Patrick Vieira, look across the 92 clubs, you're struggling to see a Black or Asian face. There are no Asian faces, but you're struggling to see another Black face. If you look at an institution like refereeing, for example, there's been one Black referee in the Premier League, in our highest division. He retired in 2008. That was Uriah Rennie. There have been no Black or Asian referees in our Premier League since then. Currently, there's one Black referee in the top 4 divisions of English football. There's never been a Black or Asian referee in the 150 years of the FA Cup. Never been a Black or Asian official refereeing that final. I could go on and on and on. There is a systemic problem when it comes to refereeing, and that's just an example of one of the challenges that we've got. I could go on, but that's a demonstration of where we're at, really.
Talking timescales to sort of improve these sort of representations of Black people, if it be LGBTQ plus people in the game and so on. How long are we talking till we can see some sort of fix to the problem?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned, the Tracy Crouch review, I think the big thing coming out of that is we have to have a compliance-based model, because what we've tried to do historically as a game, and as lots of organisations and industries, we've tried to convince leaders of business that diversity and fairness, actually, because that's what we're talking about, fair representation, is the good thing to do. And for me, that's wrong. This stuff only works if we put compliance-based models in place. So, for example, refereeing, we should clearly set targets and goals for refereeing over the next 10 years. And if those goals aren't met, there should be financial penalties. And that's not about finding people and putting them in jobs that they aren't ready for, that's essentially about becoming more meritocratic, because there is a myth in this country that we're a meritocracy, and we're not in so many ways. And that should apply to referees from all protected characteristics and all backgrounds. And it should apply in lots of different other areas of the game. We've got to get serious, and we've got to hold leaders to account in delivering change. And too many times in sport, in football, as in society, the same network of people circle round because they're in the know and they're in the right networks, and they get the jobs. I won't name any names, but we're seeing it again. We see it all the time in football through management and coaching.
There are a lot of positive initiatives being taken, such as Kick It Out, but as well through clubs. Chelsea have invested a lot into kicking out anti-Semitism. Tottenham Foundation does a lot in their community, as well as Arsenal Foundation, and that happens across the whole country. Are football clubs doing enough to help tackle discrimination?
Oh, that's a good question. Enough, I'm not sure, but I know the foundations across, and again, Millwall's a great example. Millwall gets a huge amount of stick for a small minority of the fans, and quite rightly, some of those fans' behaviour is appalling. But they do, I know for a fact, because I've been there a number of times, they do a huge amount of work in the community with people from all backgrounds, trying to kind of help and support people in the community. So I think there are great examples of football being, used in the right way to drive the right things. I just think and football, but let's be again back to your earlier question. Football can only do so much, and you could always level that football could do more. What I'd like to see in football is a focus on outcomes. I want to see more people from different backgrounds. We had a bizarre conversation probably 6 months ago about Emma Hayes from Chelsea, and what a shock it would be if she got a job in men's football. Well, why? Is it a different game? Are we seeing? Did the men play something different? I mean, she's won everything there is in the women's game. So the notion that that's a shock that she might transfer into the men's game is just laughable. So that's the kind of thing I'd like to see, is really, really clear outcomes in certainly in kind of the elite game of football, where people from different backgrounds are getting fair representation and fair opportunity. That's what I think we can do better within the game.
And what is the next step for Kick It Out in terms of how you go on from here? Is there plans to set out goals and steps to take to eradicate discrimination?
There are, yes. So end of March actually is a big time for us. So we've got a relaunch planned that you'll see, and we're going to be really clear about some of our aspirations. We're kind of step jumping our activity in the organisation. We'll be far more active in other sports going forward, assuming that we can do the right things and we can hold other sports to account. So it's an exciting time for us. It's busy, but we've got a lot going on. But for us, it's not about being in the news. This is just all we're focused on is driving change, and that's why I keep saying we want to see outcomes. I want to see Black, Asian, and female referees at the top level, without question. And I want to see a time when female referees, female players are not subject to horrific misogynistic comment as soon as they come off the pitch and on the social media platforms. So we've got a lot to do, but it's got to be outcome driven. And this isn't about PR. We've got to see change within football.
Okay, thank you. I might drop in some other questions as we go along, but I'll open the discussion up to the audience to see if there's any questions that anyone would like to ask. If you raise your hand, I might be able to see you. Yeah, Cassian McDonald. Hello, can you hear me?
Hi there, yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Hi there, yeah.
So Tony, thank you so much for that talk. I was just wanting to touch on the aspect of journalism that you were speaking about, and there are like kind of two parts to my question, two separate topics. But the first being, as you were saying, that there was a lot of attention when Patrick Vieira came into the job, that people were speaking about how isn't it great that we finally got more than one black manager at a time in the Prem. Have you noticed that there's potentially more room? I know you've discussed about it, but are there conversations within Kick It Out about the idea of increasing black journalists or Asian journalists surrounding football? Because it kind of links into with the recent AFCON, there was some people were saying there were kind of racist undertones with the way that it was being presented as a kind of knockabout tournament rather than a serious equivalent to the Euros and something that should be taken more seriously. So yeah, I was just wondering what your thoughts were on whether there's something like a quota that should be brought in or more focus within that area.
For me, Cass, yeah, definitely. I mean, the number of organisations I've worked in over the last 25 years, the only time I see change in those organisations is when they're clear about the outcome goals. And one of the outcome goals that need clarity is the representation targets. And as I said, this isn't about putting people in positions that aren't necessarily ready for it. It's about smashing the systems that are not meritocratic and making organisations find talent from different backgrounds. Because unless they're forced, people will recruit in their own image, and networks will reinforce themselves. And that's particularly true of journalism, I hasten to add. So absolutely. And we've got a program called Raise Your Game, which is our talent program. And when we relaunch that in March, you're going to see a big focus on marketing and media, trying to get people from different backgrounds with different perspectives into sports media and sports journalism.
Sorry, Cass, did you have a second question?
Yeah, I was just quickly touching on, I'm just intrigued whether you've noticed that you've had the same issues with access or racism in the women's game, and whether that's something you're going to monitor more often as the women's Prem is getting more popular and there'll be more attention, or it'll be on TV more often and more fans. And
yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, a good question. Thanks, Cass. The women's game, I think, has got some real positives. So it's far more inclusive from an LGBTQ plus player perspective. There's quite a high proportion of players that are out and open and are feeling really comfortable to be themselves, which is, I think, is a huge positive. I think the fan culture and fan behaviour is on a different level again. So I was at the Women's FA Cup final with 40,000 other people a few weeks ago, and the atmosphere was lovely. Actually, it was families, parents, kids, all together. Not a hint of toxic masculinity or any other the hideous chanting that goes on quite often in the men's game. And the other bit that kind of I thought was brilliant actually was, I don't know if you saw the game, but there was a penalty incident. Arsenal thought they should have had a penalty in the first half, and it was, when I looked at it, I thought that's Stonewall penalty. But two players approached the referee very respectfully, asked for a perspective. Referee gave perspective, and they walked away. So I think the women's game has got some fantastic lessons that can be learned. Now, as it's also got some challenges. So if you look at representation, particularly at international level, it's really different to the men's game. There are very few Black and Asian players, and part of that is accessibility. The academy infrastructure, the development infrastructure for women's football, we need to do a lot of work around that, because a lot of, as you know, a lot of the Black and Asian population in particular live in city centre and inner city areas. And the academy structure for women's football is in kind of leafy suburbs, which is quite difficult for young kids from difficult areas to access. So a lot of positives, but some stuff we've got to work on as well from a women's football perspective.
You were mentioning there how the men's game, football can become sort of a free space for quite terrible tribal behavior sometimes, and sort of, you have a free pass to do whatever you want and say whatever you want. What are the concrete sort of workshops that are taking place, examples of things that are happening to try and change that culture?
Well, it's quite a few. So Chelsea have been a great example around the use of anti-Semitism, the use of the Y word. So they've been really active in terms of education. They've got a restorative justice program around anti-Semitism. They've been active when it comes to issuing bans, as have a lot of clubs. So that kind of stuff is really important. You can't just, in some cases, absolutely, a ban is absolutely the right thing to do. But in a lot of cases, this is about education and telling people, particularly where young people are involved, that it's not appropriate and it's not acceptable. We have a fan education manager that's very busy, actually, where something doesn't cross the threshold for hate crime or criminal behaviour. We tend to try and work with the clubs to try and educate supporters around appropriate versus inappropriate behaviour. The other thing, just to say on that, Lucie, is fans have got a huge role in this, and you'll have seen we have a program called Fans for Diversity, which we run with the Football Supporters Association. And just in the last since 2014, in 2014 there were two LGBTQ plus fan groups. There are now over 60 across the 92 clubs in the country, and it came to the fore actually. I realised the power of this last year before Christmas when the Liverpool fans were using the Rent Boy chant. And I can't remember which game it was on the Saturday. By the Tuesday, the Liverpool LGBTQ plus supporters group had kind of put statements out there, really powerful statements, and they recorded a video with Jurgen Klopp to the broader supporter group saying, we don't want that in our club, so just don't do it. That's really powerful. That's about fans kind of getting together and setting the behavioural standards they want for their clubs. And I think that's going to happen more and more often now as we get fans from different groups supporting their clubs and kind of saying, no, we don't want to be part of that.
I think we have a question from Lucie. Can you talk?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Tony, I just had one question for you. You talked about the intersectionality of race, education, and income groups, and especially you talked about, with respect to the women's game, kind of inner city groups of people who might not have access to systems that are created for kind of the middle class, maybe. Following on from this, I was wondering what kind of kick it out or what can be done to help people into more managerial roles, especially people from lower income backgrounds?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. It's a really good question. I think it's multifaceted. So in terms of participation, I think at grassroots level, there's a lot of work going on with things like Football Foundation to try and work through this problem. And I know for a fact that there's the plan that they're going to invest a huge amount of money into creating facilities and better facilities at local level, particularly in inner cities that are accessible. Just a good example is, if anyone's ever been to any of the Goals soccer centres or something similar, a peak time court at a place like Goals can cost 80 odd quid, 90 quid in some areas for an hour, which is just not feasible for a lot of young people from inner cities and poor backgrounds. So there's a lot of work going on to open those kind of avenues up. There's also a lot of initiatives around coaching, because one of the challenges about helping people through the coaching pyramid is that the expense of when you get to level 1 is not too bad, but when you start talking about level 2 and particularly level 3 and upwards, it's hugely expensive. So we need to try and open up more scholarships for people to access those coaching qualifications. So again, we're working with the FA and the Premier League. Premier League have just developed a program called Coach Index, which is designed to help do that through the elite level. But there's lots of work going on again with the FA and with us to try and put more scholarships in place to help people from poor backgrounds to get on the coaching ladder and develop their careers if that's what they want to do.
And on those players, maybe ex-players or other official individuals who want to maybe take that step, why are they also not taking the step, perhaps to join this sort of breadth of coaching as much as we'd hope to see?
Do you mean black players in particular, Maurizio?
Yes.
There are actually there are a huge number of qualified black coaches. There's a network of qualified black coaches in the UK that have a kind of social network group, and there's over 200 members of it, all with professional backgrounds, all looking for jobs in the elite game. And it's a challenge. We've got to try and create. And I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail, but it's the reason there aren't significantly more black managers is because there aren't significantly more black coaches being given jobs and opportunities in the system to come through. And that's what Coach Index is designed to do with the Premier League. So the Premier League essentially have developed a database of black and Asian coaches and female coaches, so that when Premier League clubs in particular are recruiting coaches for academies, there's a database there of people, because quite often in these situations, the challenge level back from football clubs is that we just can't find black or Asian coaches. Well, you've got a database now with hundreds of black and Asian and female coaches on there. So if you don't tell us you can't find them, access and interview, and if they're appropriate, give them opportunities.
Do we have any other questions from the audience at all? No. That's fine. I'll ask. I have lots of questions to ask. So on the point of social media again, just to build a little bit more on that, how many, just talking about numbers, what is the sort of scale of, how many reported crimes have been and how many arrests there have been of online abusers?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I think we're. I know after the Euros, there's probably been at least 30 arrests of people who sent abusive messages. And I know thus far there's been at least 5 criminal convictions of those people, which doesn't sound a huge number, but had that been 4 years ago, that we wouldn't have had anyone arrested. And then the background to that was that the police were, I say the social media organisations weren't prepared. The police were. The police had a really high performance unit ready to field the abuse, and they honed in on the perpetrators really quickly. That's why we're kind of seeing the success. But that's arguably that's easier to do, because it's like I said, we all knew where the risks were and what might happen, and so as soon as it happened, the police were ready and they kind of followed through on it quickly.
And what were the steps when you were with the West Midlands Police? What sort of changes did you see there under the police force, and maybe linking into football in the West Midlands and area? How much difference was there, from when you started to 2021?
It's a challenging one, because I won't go into policing in a huge amount of detail, but for anyone who's, I hope you've not unfortunately had the pleasure of the police, but the police in this country, one of the brilliant things about policing is that we police by consent. So, but to do that, our police, 120,000 police, could not conduct their jobs without the consent of the public, the 66 million UK citizens. But to do that, you've got to have legitimacy, which means that you've got to have trust. And we've all seen recently that the police trust is being eroded. And there's a lot of things that impact trust. Procedural justice is one of the things that massively impacts trust. I know we're going off the point here, I'll come back to it. But procedural justice is about the way you're treated. It's about the respect police have for the members of the public. That's why trust is being eroded at the minute, and I feel as a member of the public, I don't see the trust, the respect from the police force to me as a citizen in lots of ways. Misogyny is a great example. Race relations over many years is a great example. And so I think the police have got a huge amount of work to do to re-earn the trust of the public. I think from a certain communities' perspective, so, I'm a bit older. I remember when being a gay man, for example, was criminalised. And so the gay men of my age and older remember the time when police persecuted them. I remember the sus laws in the 80s and the 90s where police could stop and search me with no good reason whatsoever, other than the fact that they suspected I might be about to commit a crime. So I think getting legitimacy from communities is really challenging. And that's why I also say that I don't think having a kind of Stuart Ward everywhere is the answer, because for the Stuart Ward everywhere to work requires the trust of the black community. And I don't think they've got that. And we see that sometimes with the players. I don't want to speak for all players because that's a PFA's job. But if you grow up in a black community like Birmingham, for example, you've been stopped and searched throughout your entire youth, then you're subject to abuse on a Saturday or on social media. You're not going to pick up the phone to the very people that you don't trust to try and sort that out. And so the police now quite often say to us, well, I want to sort this out, but that player won't speak to us. Well, that's because he got stopped and searched 2 weeks ago, and you ask him, what's a black so-and-so like you doing driving a car like this? So, don't come to us with those arguments. So it's all it's complicated, but it's a societal construct. This is why we've got to get into what is racism, what is discrimination, and where's it come from, and how do we kind of dismantle it? Because it's all interlinked, obviously.
We have 2 questions, and then I think that'll be time's up. Alex Slam, if you unmute, maybe, yeah.
Hi, it's actually Josh, by the way. I feel like you're going to use the name, but there's a few of us all listening together, that's why. My question was, you mentioned Qatar in there at one point, which I think is interesting. And definitely, like, as a fan who sometimes goes to follow England, I've definitely had second thoughts about whether to go there as a fan. But do you think there's any responsibility on like players and the footballing community itself? Because I know players have been understandably very outspoken, for example, after receiving racist abuse at the Euros. But I haven't really heard anything from any player or Gareth Southgate or etc. as to like, why is this World Cup taking place here? Should we be going here? What's going to be done about it? That kind of thing, mainly just from the likes of us or the media occasionally. So is there an onus on the game and the players to do that?
I think this is where it gets again quite challenging. Thanks for the question. It's for me, I'd say yes. I'd love for players to feel comfortable enough to come out, but this is the fine line between kind of politics and sport. I think it's for the football governing bodies to explain why they've awarded that competition to a place like Qatar. And we formed a Qatar working group where we're looking at, one of the things that actually we're focusing on is how we can make Qatar a safe experience for people from all backgrounds, particularly people from LGBTQ plus backgrounds. And let's not forget the tens of thousands of people that were going over there to cover this from a journalistic perspective. A lot of those colleagues will be from LGBTQ plus backgrounds. They haven't got a choice as to whether they go. They'll have to go for work. So I think the players have got some stuff they can do, but I think the players are being put in a difficult situation. You know, we all know on average about 6% approximately of UK population is LGBTQ plus. So we know that there'll be a percentage of professional footballers, although none feel safe enough to come out at the minute, but there'll be a percentage that are LGBTQ plus. If you're a gay player and you're being asked to participate in Qatar 22, how do you feel about that? And being asked to be in an environment like that where your sexuality is illegal. So it's a challenge. I don't know. I think we ask our players a bit too much sometimes, and I think that's a challenging one. I'd love it if they did, but I also understand if it's a debate that they didn't feel able to get involved in.
And we have a question from Adi.
Hi guys, thanks for the interview. It was incredibly interesting. I just had a question, which I do apologize if it's too big for the end of the interview, but it was in discussions of tackling racism, the word education is brought up so frequently. And I wanted to ask, how can we actually act on educating people, and what does that actually consist of? Because it's brought up so much, and perhaps how we can actually introduce it isn't brought up as much in the media.
It's a good one, Ali. Thank you. I think education sometimes, I'll be honest again, is used as an excuse. So there are situations where, and it was used all through that discussion about taking the knee. All we need to do is tell people about the history of taking the knee and educate people about it, and everything will be fine, which ignores completely the point that a number of people who were doing taking the knee were doing it because they are overtly racist. And no amount of education is going to change that. I think so. So there's firstly, there's that acknowledgement of that. But I think education, for me, it's about young people in schools. It's about the history of Black and Asian people in this country, the fact that Black and Asian people participated in world wars. It's about the history of slavery, which we touch on in a kind of really kind of glorified way in our education system. It's about the history of colonialism and the legacy of colonialism in a really honest way. And so people, Black and Asian kids in particular, but also kids from all backgrounds, can understand where racism came from and how it impacts modern day society. It's a construct. To deconstruct it, we've got to have conversations. Those conversations have to start at a really young age for me, because we're losing too many young people now by not having the conversation. And I worry that my kids and grandkids are going to be having the same conversations we're having now, unless we really start focusing on education in schools and telling people the truth. We're not asking for fabrications here. That's the other thing I just want to make clear. We're asking for true history to be taught appropriately to young people.
Brilliant. I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for coming, Tony. It's been a pleasure. It's been a really great discussion.
Thanks for asking. No problem at all.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mauricio. I'll see you soon.
Yeah.